Allow me to reintroduce myself. My name is Ho. H to the OV. I used to move snowflakes by the OZ. I guess even back then you can call me CEO of the ROC. Ho. Fresh out the frying pan into the fire. I be the music.
Welcome to Two Bros, One Book. I'm Lloyd.
And I'm Will.
And this week we're talking about a book called The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zeihan, subtitled Mapping the Collapse of Globalization. I think both of us in this case listened to the audiobook.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah, so we'll be giving our reactions to that as well, and talking about what the book's about and how we felt about it. So, Will, why don't you quickly give us a summary of what this book is kind of about?
Sure. So, well, firstly, Peter Zeihan, I think it's pronounced.
Zeihan, I think.
Oh, Zeihan. Okay, fine. But he's American. So. It sounds kind of like European, but I think he's based in American. Based off his accent, is a geopolitician or geopolitical strategist, maybe? I'm not sure exactly.
Geopolitical, I think geopolitical analyst, yeah.
Analyst, okay, sure. Yeah, so I think he published this book in 2022, so a couple years ago. And in this work, Zeihan argues that the era of globalization, which has very much defined the world economy since mid-20th century, well, since the end of World War II, is essentially coming to an end. And he
especially since the 1990s, right?
Sure. And he kind of attributes this shift to a number of factors, such as demographic changes, in particular the aging population, geopolitical tensions, and really the sort of retreat of the United States from its role as the, I guess, kind of guarantor of global security, and particularly naval security, which impacts global trade significantly, as Zeihan poses it. So he kind of suggests that the world is now transitioning into a phase of de-globalization, leading to increased regionalism, isolation, and kind of self-sufficiency, really. And this transition is expected to disrupt global supply chains, elevate production costs.
To cause de-industrialization of large parts of the world, yeah.
Exactly. And also impacting various sectors. I think he had dedicated chapters to each one. There was transportation, finance, energy, manufacturing, agriculture, etc.
Materials also, yeah.
Exactly. And he kind of positions the states, due to its geographic advantages, like with natural resources and stuff, as relatively in sort of a much better position to navigate these changes. And I think that's more or less it. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say, Zeihan is accused of being a Trumper or a Trump supporter. I'm not exactly sure that would be a fair estimation.
I think he's self-proclaimed a Democrat. I think.
Well, I mean, what that means these days is never 100% clear, right?
Sure.
But I think it's not a very political book, although it is a very I would call it an Americanist book.
For sure.
It's very very much bought into the idea of American manifest destiny, and with some let's say some good reason, some things that we'll explain, and then maybe a little bit of I would say there are shades of American exceptionalism, and the framing of the book is in such a way that you are meant to draw the conclusion that America is the center of the universe, and that it will remain the center of the universe, and the fact that it won't be the center of the universe is bad for the universe.
And it's kind of going
Um,
against the tide a little bit, because there is a rise in suspicion, or um, there's a lot of trending topics around the kind of the fall of the USA, like the demise of the US kingdom and the upcoming of China and stuff. So it does go against the tide a little bit, I would say. And
which I
I
mean,
did,
the
yeah, go on.
go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I do to an extent at times feel like it is quite a fantastical claim he's making to kind of go against the time. And at times I kind of felt like he's almost working backwards just to prove it, which I think is a very sweeping statement. And we can delve into that in a little bit, I guess. I just wonder if you had the same kind of feeling.
Well, it's funny. It's funny you should say that, because I think actually in the field of especially Americanist geopolitics, you've probably never read anything by like George Friedman. So the next 100 years, for example, is
No.
also a very Americanist geopolitical take. This is kind of gospel in that community, right? Because I mean, there are some good reasons. Actually, I found the analysis of China to be probably one of the most salient of the book. I think there's a lot of hand waving about how America is just gonna, manage all these things swimmingly. But the
Well, you say salient. Did you agree with his, perhaps not information that he shared, but the conclusions he drew? Because I actually,
so
yeah, go on.
if you kind of go into the background of this theory, the theory essentially goes that China is right now living somewhat on borrowed time, and that a lot of what they've been doing over the last 30 years especially has been very much selling the future for the present. And the reason, I mean, if you're going back to the basics, I think actually the book does a poor job of establishing the fundamentals, because he almost goes back to the basics of geopolitics at the end instead of the beginning, which he's already given you his opinion on China, and then he's explaining how agricultural civilizations rise and fall.
Yeah, perhaps that's why I kind of felt like the claim was up front and then it was kind of
Yeah,
reverse engineered.
I think it was because he was. I imagine the book was framed in such a way that it would appeal to people who would look for that conclusion.
I think so.
But
I think so. Yeah.
but the basis for the conclusion is that if you look at China, it historically is a rich coastal urban center, or several urban centers, a poor unpopulated middle, which is the breadbasket, and a constant struggle for the country to remain unified, while the interests of the coastal, sort of the East Coast, and the industrialism and the development of the East Coast sort of plays catch up or leads against the rest of the world, and the western part of the country is sort of left behind. And the problem with, if you look at the one-child policy, if you look at the way he talks about in the book about hyperscaling, hyperfinance, the way that the government has continually invested just endless amounts of money into development. A lot of this is buying growth for the sake of stability, not creating stability for the sake of growth.
Well,
right?
yeah, and leveraging, perhaps up until now and no further, the cheap labor from those poorer central regions to benefit from the coastal regions. And it's funny because media, certainly at the moment, and again, it's trending, kind of depicts China as this technologically advanced place where they don't rely on cheap labor and they rely on automation and technology, whilst Zeihan clearly claims, at least, that that's not the case.
Well,
And
it has been the case until now, but the labor, he talks about in the book how over the last 30 years, I mean, in a way, China has always been surprising to Western analysts because it continually does things that no one else would be able to achieve, like moving 300 or 400 million people from the Western hinterlands into the
mm,
Eastern urban areas. But it did it in such a way that it needed those workers to replace aging populations. They had a one-child policy, so they were not replacing themselves. And it did it in such a way that basically half of the country is essentially a servant class, essentially
mhm.
a labor, a slave, a wage slave
So
class.
so let's break this down though. So we're saying that Xi is aware there's a depopulation issue. Of course, I mean I know Zeihan says he has no friends, he has no advisors left. Um,
Yeah,
but clearly he knows there's a depopulation issue on the horizon. He's already tried to solve it. It's getting worse, apparently.
yeah.
Um, Obviously,
Well, I think it's.
his term is not restricted to 4 years. His long term strategies can pan out. Do we not think it's likely that he probably has thought about this and has some long term plan in place to mitigate?
Well, I mean, if you look at analysis of China from the past, repeatedly analysts like George Friedman have underestimated China's ability to
Right,
control its population.
precisely.
So one of the things, if you look at the current state of China, why is it a hyper Orwellian, hyper data driven, hyper repressive society? Why does it have its own kind of separate internet? Why does it have, why does it have all these things? It's because that is what is necessary at this point to keep it politically stable. Why are they now, building out, an infrastructure of essentially concentration camps in the western parts of the country?
Mm,
Because people look around and see that the wealth of the country is not being shared with them because the West has been and by the way, we're now going to be banned in China, which is totally fine for me. But they, you know, they they have been living on borrowed time, and Zeihan's argument is like China doesn't think in the long term. China thinks in the short term,
but there are
and
there are
those.
strategies. I can't name any top of my head. I don't think maybe you can, but there are long term strategies that we've seen unfold in China across
Yeah,
over a decade.
I think it was going to be one of my arguments actually was that I think Zeihan, for the most part, he gets some things right, like saying the population issue in China is obviously serious.
Mm,
The
clearly, yeah.
authoritarianism is obviously a reaction to the depopulation. The authoritarianism is a reaction to the fact that they're running out of cheap labor, that they need to keep people repressed, and but I think what he does throughout the book is sort of gild the lily, if you know what I mean,
Mm,
and continually sort of build up this picture of impending chaos, and not acknowledge that, like, actually, throughout history, countries have gotten themselves into very dire situations and kept persevering somehow. you
right.
know the Certainly the quality of life can go down, the amount of freedom that people experience can go down, but countries go to quite extreme measures to preserve themselves.
Absolutely.
um
And I do feel at times, especially with China, when he's talking about China, he does disregard technology. I mean, look at China's
yeah,
investment in AI. If they do have, cheap labor costs rising to a significant degree, then, as we both have discussed many times, I do not believe AI can replace human beings entirely, but it certainly can empower them to have more work throughput. Maybe that's why
yeah.
they're investing in AI. I mean, there's loads of technologies we could discuss that would mitigate a lot of the challenges that he presents, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean,
It's quite a
Zehan sort
negative.
of.
It's quite a negative perspective, I think, generally.
Well, it is, and it has to be to support the kind of American exceptionalism that the book is based on. And
That's right. Yeah.
I think there's, there's a point to this. It's such a hairball of ideas, that I think what I was saying, he was gilding the lily of, creating this very dire picture of very complicated global supply chains. And he's right on all the details. He's right. China relies on huge amounts of imported fertilizers, for example.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, they
Huge
import
amounts
most of their calorie intake, their energy, right?
yeah.
Like most things.
Well, even if it's not their calorie intake, it's the precursors. It's the
Yeah.
potassium, it's the nitrogen, it's the oil. All these things you need to make food. And he's constantly building up all of these, dominoes, and saying you push one of these over and everything falls apart. But it's also like, no, what actually happens historically? Like he was talking about potassium. And he's using the example that like China uses 4 to 5 times as much potassium and other precursors to industrial fertilizer as other countries do because of its poor water and soil quality. Um, and he points out, okay, if there's a disruption, and he uses the example, which I think is fairly ridiculous, of like, oh, what if one oil barge doesn't reach one refinery in India, and that doesn't, and I'm thinking, really? Because then he immediately says, well, actually, there's too much potassium in the soil already because they've been oversaturating it. So actually, they'd be fine for like
a
10
while,
years.
Yeah.
But it's like, well, don't countries, when there are extreme needs, don't they very quickly convert? Like I was thinking of the Warsaw Pact. I was thinking of Czechoslovakia, communist Czechoslovakia. Many Western analysts were saying, the Soviet Union and the communist countries, their agro policies are going to lead to huge, famines, which they did in Russia. But they didn't here, and the efficiency was very low. But what happened is that people took up farming. They took up, they took up a much more active role in feeding themselves, but they didn't go hungry because people don't want to go hungry. Like even, and he's talking about China ceasing to exist because it can't get fertilizer. And I'm thinking, well, North Korea didn't cease to exist and they couldn't get food. They don't have any dogs left in the country because they ate them all, in the 90s. And they're still around. I mean, like, they're not a really functional state, but it's still there. They still do things that states do. So it's sort of, and the repression and the violence, the state violence was so much worse than what China has now. So I'm thinking, really, is there so little slack? He builds up this picture of a world, about just-in-time logistics and very high efficiency everything, and argues, there's no slack left in any of these lines anywhere. And so one false move, and essentially billions of people
just-in-time manufacturing is a little bit like that, I guess.
Sure,
but I feel like
it is.
But I feel like he applies that same, he applies that same theory to just about everything he talks about.
Well, yeah, and also the fact is that just-in-time logistics is in service of vast overconsumption. Vast overproduction, to the point where we produce way more products than we reasonably need, and then we have to find ways to sell them. So to me, and he's talking about, oh, maybe, cars, you won't be able to have, the 50 processors or whatever inside of a car. And I'm thinking, well, you didn't need those 50 processors though. You need like 2 or 3. Right? So you don't need the airbags don't need to have microchips, right?
Well, I guess this bodes an interesting question as to like what he really means by de-industrialization, de-globalization, and whether actually is that really a terrible, terrible thing?
Well, yeah, and he makes the point that deindustrialization, so this means returning to essentially hand to mouth
Mm,
agricultural living. I think he makes a decent point that countries that rely mostly on imported goods and have very few skills, like as countries, are going to suffer. You
mm.
know, countries that don't have a lot of things to barter with that exist currently because the world produces a lot of cheap stuff are going to have big problems. And that makes sense, you know, on its face. I would say there's, you know, there's something to that.
Mm.
um does that mean that, you know, literally the world is going to starve? Well, I tend to doubt it, because, you know, when people are hungry, they grow more food, you know, and they grow food that can be grown locally, and they get used to consuming less.
Well, and there's
um
also technology that's looking to address that, right? The genomics work that's going on, and
yeah, that was
lab
another
meat,
example
and
where he's talking about how in the West, you know, we have all this, you know, organic farming and stuff, and how that uses way more resources than it
mm,
produces, how it's
mm,
really not good for the ecology, which I completely agree with. But the
mm.
thing is, if there are going to be global famines, right, the first thing we're going to do, like in you know, countries that are facing any kind of food issues, is ban organic farming, and, you know, a large scale organic farming, or tax it out of existence, and you know, uh, and adopt
Well, I guess his argument is
uh,
that it's kind of a double whammy, because you with the de globalization, let's say America does pull out of their role as guaranteeing safe trade. As
yeah.
well as that, we also have the depopulation issue. So there will be less
Yeah.
consumerism as well on a whole.
Yeah, but
So
this is his point,
yeah,
that if the essentially, maybe we're getting sort of lost in the weeds of all this. His point is that as world populations peak and start to decline, because the cost of living is has gone up and the birth rates have gone down, the
yeah. So
main issue
just to
is,
clarify that, basically his argument is that you know. Back in the day, you'd be incentivized to have kids because you could put them to work, and it was an economic benefit for your family. These days, it's an economic burden for a family because they're expensive.
right. And the problem with having a world that's depopulating is that countries that don't produce a lot of high value goods that a lot of people need
Mm,
don't have the means to support themselves in, uh, you know, in a world where, if markets are are getting smaller, then, for example, producer countries like America have less reason to send them food, right? So if you, you know, today you have 50 million people in Nigeria, and, you know, in 10 years they're going to have 40 million people. Well, that's a smaller market for goods, so you're going to send less goods there, and then they're going to have less to choose from, and then they're going to have even fewer people because it's going to be more expensive, and then they're going to have even less. So it's like,
mm,
populations go down, and that causes markets around the world to contract, which is true, right? That will happen. I think
mm.
it has to happen. But the question that, you know, the way that he builds that up to be like a global famine where half of the population could be, you know, could starve, I think,
I
it
think it's
doesn't seem likely
pessimistic.
to me.
I think it's pessimistic. Yeah,
Well,
I
yeah,
agreed.
it just doesn't seem likely.
I think
Certainly,
I think the signals and the trends that he's identified are undeniable, and I actually found reading those super interesting
yeah.
and gripping. Um, but again, I just feel like the conclusion that he's drawn is really just to sell a book, honestly. Um,
Well, of course, and he, I mean, he famously, you know, what people say about him, just to give, you know, an idea, of people who are into geopolitics will say he's one of these guys who predicted 17 of the last two market collapses. right? You know,
Yeah.
he's always predicting doom and gloom, and you know, he can be right occasionally.
But apparently
Um,
he does have. I mean, he must have some level of credentials at the same time. I mean, I know he works for an intelligence agency, I think, or has done in the US. He works for the United States Defense Department, apparently.
this,
Um,
you know, I'm a little bit more skeptical of that kind of thing because, to be honest, it's like George Friedman. Like, yeah, they can have interesting analysis, but on the other hand, working for the U.S. State Department could also just mean, you know, he says what they want to hear,
mm,
and you know, and they, you know, they can shop for opinions,
sure.
and they can hire someone who's going to tell them China is going to fail, and you know, you don't need to invest in, you know, defending Taiwan, for example, because if
Hmm.
China invades Taiwan, then they're going to lose access to this market, and then they're going to have this problem, and pretty soon you've convinced yourself that people aren't going to do things that are stupid, when the reality is that people are going to do stupid things for
Sure.
reasons that you haven't thought of yet.
Mm,
um, and so I think, to a degree, I don't take the fact that people pay him to talk to them as, you know, an indication that he's right about anything. But but if you just take the, I would say, we can get into our recommendations for this book. I think if you
sure.
take the book at face value as analysis, there are a lot of interesting things. If you take it as a predictive
Mm,
value, I think it's horribly simplistic, because the reality is, you know, people don't like starving. Uh, you know, people don't like losing access to things, and they will fight and they will work hard to get access to them. And by the way, you know, the whole thing is kind of dependent on the idea that, and I think this is another Americanist thing, of like global capitalism is the final form of political economy in history. That's, you know, uh, Slavoj Žižek famously said that Americans can better imagine the end of the world than the end of
mm.
capitalism. And I think there's something to that, which is, you know, he's imagining that if the capitalist system that we global system that we currently live in is changing, that change is necessarily an end of the world, you
Mm,
know, an end times condition, which is like, you know, and that that has a kind of its roots in a cultural supremacist ideology that, like, you know, when the Roman Empire fell, civilization ended, right? Except it
mm.
didn't, right? Ideas didn't actually go away, technology didn't actually disappear.
Yeah,
Some of it did,
augmented. Yeah.
but not all of it. And you know, the next thing was better. So this idea of, like, you know, the great civilizations like America, if they're not leading the world, then no one is. You
Mm,
know, I don't think, I don't think that makes a lot of sense. um People, you know, people are always striving to do better. You take it more in a direction of like, you're more of a technology, you know, believer than I
mm-hmm,
am.
mm.
um I don't think it's about technology. I think it's more at a base of like ingenuity. People recognize problems, and then they look for solutions to those problems. Sometimes those solutions are horrifying, but
Sure,
they
and I
are
think
solutions.
that's part of the same story, right? I think the
Yeah,
need comes first and the technology comes after, and I think applying that to the book, I think the need is already there, and I think technology is
yeah,
already being offered. Even
yeah.
he says things like
It's
China's
going to cease to
quality in
exist.
well, he said that's going to happen in 10 years, which is ridiculous. But I think he also said that China's renowned for really low grade, low quality manufacturing. Now, I know that's not true.
Right.
I know that's not true. And I mean, everyone does. Your iPhone was made in China. Foxconn is a
Yeah.
Chinese manufacturing company.
But
And
not as
okay,
much,
maybe that's what.
not as much now as it used to be. But yeah. I
Sure,
mean, now,
it's
like,
it's global now, yeah.
but
But
still, yeah.
and he could say, okay, well, that's one factory. It's like, yeah, but it's China. If it's one factory, it can be every factory within a month because
Yeah.
because of the systems there. So, yeah, I don't know.
And I think yeah, we can look at those things as big challenges, maybe even things that are game changing for the world. But like he gives the example of like Taiwan being, the place where all the best computer chips come from.
That's
And
right.
I'm thinking like, okay, yeah, sure it is. But, think about what happened. What it reminded me of was a story from like World War II, right? We we had just developed. If you go back to World War II, it's the first proper, or let's say the continuation of the first proper industrial war. So the theory around around air supremacy was you can you can make bombers, and those bombers can destroy in the industrial plant, and you destroy the industrial plant, and that destroys a country's ability to wage war, and then you can win the war, right? Because we just had airplanes were new, the airplanes could carry huge bombs, so we thought perfect. You bomb Japanese cities, you bomb German cities, that destroys their plants to make ball bearings, then without ball bearings they can't make tanks, and then you win. And we tried that, and it resulted in the destruction of most of the cities in two whole countries. But the war was not won by that, right?
Mm.
Uh, what happened in Russia when Germany invaded? They they packed up and shipped entire factories from the western part of the country to Moscow and east, right? They rebuilt things from scratch, day and night, and that happened all over the world. So all this area bombing, all this strategic bombing that was supposed to shortcut, short circuit countries' systems to win the war, never happened, right? Never came to fruition, because it turns out if you blow up a ball bearing factory, then someone can go to a gumball factory, retool it, and make it into a ball bearing factory,
Mm.
or figure out a way to use half as many ball bearings, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reality. Like, what if China invades Taiwan? Well, we'll live with the products we have now for the 5 years it takes to build all those plants somewhere else, right?
Mm.
But you don't need to have 10 super high performance computer chips in your car, and you don't need to have a new car this year. And I think it's interesting that he uses COVID as this framing of like, look what happens when a global pandemic hits and all the supply chains are interrupted. And it's like, well, actually, yeah, look at it. Did technology fall back 20 years? Did a new iPhone model stop coming out? Did any of that stuff happen?
Mm.
And the supply chains were completely disrupted, and yet things things continued to progress, right? Because there was a
Yeah, I
will.
mean, there's been, I mean, there's been loads of issues like that over the past 10 years. I remember Steel Mountain, my previous company. There was a
Mm,
massive shortage of capacitors
yeah.
to build circuit boards. A global shortage. It was an absolute disaster. Everyone thought that everyone's supply chains within a year were going to be bust. Didn't hear of it again.
Yeah, because
Somehow it was solved. So
what happens, the people who have, and this from working on a manufacturing startup, the people who have deal flow and order flow suddenly realize that order flow is worth money. So if
mhm,
someone else needs it more than I do, I can sell it, right?
exactly.
It's like with airplanes. Like what happened during COVID was certain airlines, stopped. Well, I should say certain airlines stopped buying airplanes. They took their deal flow, their orders for those airlines, and they sold them to somebody else, and
Yeah.
somebody else bought them. So who it's getting made for, and when that changes, but um, people want fundamentally, I think people want to work, they want to engage in commerce, so they're going to find ways to do it.
Well, that's the other
And
side of globalization, I think, is globalization isn't just political relationships between governments, it's also between individuals and people as well.
yeah,
Um, One of the
Yeah, and
things
I
I
think
found.
this is where
Go on.
Zehan sort of falls down, in my opinion, is that he is constantly talking about what countries need, which is fine.
Mm,
That's a way. That's also a way for geopolitical thinkers to look at things. They look at places
mm,
according to geographies, right? And they say, look here. There's a city next to a river, and that puts them near a port, and it makes them
mm.
want this, and it makes them want to do that. And it's like that's fine, but also there are thousands and millions of actors, actual actors in all those places,
Exactly, exactly.
and
And
they're
perhaps I'm
also
naive, but
thinking.
I exactly, exactly. So
Yeah.
I had the same
No, I think
observation as
that's
well.
right. And it's like what happens in my experience, what happens if you have a situation where you can't produce something, say you can't produce 10% of all the capacitors in the world are, not able to be produced. Well, I would imagine that the industry finds a way to make products with 10% less capacitors that still
Mm,
work. And
exactly.
then they end up finding a solution that's actually better than the capacitors, right?
Mm,
It's it was the example with also with electric cars, where he's like, the switching to electric cars is not going to help us you know end our dependency on fossil fuels, which I think is true. um,
I
but
agree.
uh,
Yeah.
he doesn't go one further and say, like, yeah, if America wants to get sort of monopoly access to the world's lithium, then the rest of the world is going to figure out another material,
And this was a
right?
general theme I found, is that he kind of catastrophized a lot and shared his predictions, which were quite bleak, to say the
Yeah.
least. But he didn't really, in his presumably expert opinion, provide any solutions. And I do think there are solutions to these problems, as we've discussed. And I found that quite frustrating at times.
Well, there are always it's something that you have to understand from history, that yeah, empires rise and fall, but people keep the people keep evolving, and they keep adapting. And people in general, I mean, people do accept very poor living conditions, but they usually try to do something about it. And he sort of
Mm,
infantilizes a little bit a lot of these places where, frankly, the global system has really hollowed them out, hollowed out their industries, hollowed out their intellectual development, hollowed out their technological development. Well, if globalism stops doing that, stops flooding those markets with cheap products, those people are going to then start thinking for themselves, right?
mm,
And that can be a good thing, you know. So
yeah.
I don't. It's like arguing that, like, uh, the Soviet Union was sort of a fallen civilization because they couldn't feed their own people, but they were also landing probes on Venus, at the same time. Like, they
Hmm.
were doing things that the West was never able to do, right? So I don't know. It's an uneven thing, right? It's not all one thing.
Yeah.
And
And I
states
and
and
I
states, most importantly, don't behave as actors, right? They're people.
exactly. And I think he just I think he focused too much on governments and kind of policy rather than people. Um,
Yeah, and his arguments of things like, saying the European Union is doomed because of regulations.
yeah, it's
And
ridiculous.
I'm sort of like, come on, come on. I mean, like, if it really started, the thing is, you and I live in Europe and have for many years. The reality is, if our quality of life went down, we would get rid of regulations until it didn't. We're not
Exactly.
we're not stupid. It's like the like,
It's not the
you know, you,
constitution. We can change them.
yeah. It's not like we sit around going, oh well, we're all hungry now, but we better keep so that olive oil has to be individually packaged. No, that's not
Yeah.
what you do. If you're hungry, then you figure out ways to make it doable. Like, those regulations don't
Yeah.
don't stay.
One thing One thing I wanted to talk about, to discuss, and get your opinions on was um, the possibility of the US pulling its kind of moving away, let's say, from its role as guarantor of global security for trade. I found that quite interesting and potentially topical, with obviously the elections earlier this week,
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
the shell shock of the 5th of November, still settling into
I'm not.
that.
I'm not shocked.
I'm not
I'm not
shocked.
shocked.
I guess I'm not shocked. I'm disappointed. I did actually make a lot of what Zeihan was discussing in such a negative, um, through such a negative lens, kind of land for me. I had actually finished the book before the election results, but it did find me pondering after that about a lot of what
I
Zeihan was
think
saying, whether it was going to
I think
play
first of
out or not.
all, I think there's a book. There's a book called "The Next 100 Years" by George Friedman, and he does a much better job of arguing this. He calls this the 20-year framing problem, and he says what people do is they take they take the way things are today, like literally today, this week, and they go, if this continues for 20 years, because that's how I think in my mind. I'm 39, so I'm imagining what's it going to be like when I'm 59, right?
Mm.
Uh, they multiply the trend over the last year times 20, and they say that's the future, right? But that's not how history works, because trends that are accelerating have also they do have momentum, but they also have an accelerating reaction, right?
Mm.
um, America went from, kind of electing a kind of fascist in 2016, who, it was almost like a joke to some people. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't obvious that he really knew what he wanted to do, to 8 years later actually affirmatively electing an actual person who is a fascist, right?
Mm.
That's, that's a trend. And then we look at that and we go, oh my God, in 20 years, can you imagine? It's going to be Nazi Germany. And it's like, well, maybe it is. But also,
Well, that's what I
there is
mean.
an
It does make it feel, what he's saying, his words, a little more potent, right?
but
Because
I think you can't look at the day to day and the year, even the year to year thing, and say there isn't an accelerating reaction to that, right? The fact is, 8 years ago, um, Americans didn't believe that this could happen to them, and so they weren't prepared, and they weren't
mm,
willing. They weren't
well, it's like
willing to.
Brexit. It's like
Yeah,
Brexit, right? It's exactly
yeah,
the
they
same.
weren't exactly Brexit. They weren't willing to do things like prosecute people who lied to the public. They weren't willing to investigate corruption. They weren't willing to hold themselves accountable for any of that. Now we get to Trump getting elected for real this time. People are ready. They understand that, okay, if you want to get power back, you actually have to take it back. And if you want to take it back, you actually have to organize. And if you want to do that, you need to, you know, I was saying this from when Biden was running. The Democrats in America, they thought that they could get by just by telling the public we're not as bad as them. We want things to go back to normal. That's what they said. Stop the madness, which is fine. But the thing is, we've seen younger people they don't want to vote for that. They don't want to vote for status quo. They don't want to vote for protecting their rights. They don't want to vote for keeping things the same. They don't want to vote for decency. They want to vote for a future. Even if the future is terrifying, they want to vote for something. They want to vote for something different.
But
So
what are they voting
now,
for? Because you say it's different, but I don't think I've ever heard Trump talk about policy before. For goodness'
no, no,
sake,
yeah, it's not. It's a vibe.
like
It's
what are they
completely.
voting?
It's no. It's nothing to do with policy. What I'm talking about is literally like a vibe difference. You know what I
I
mean?
see. I
Like
see.
people
Mm.
want to vote for. It's gonna be different, dude, because it's different. It
Yeah,
doesn't
make
mean
America great again. Blah blah blah.
we're
Yeah,
right, right, exactly. That's
marketing.
what that whole thing is. It's like, oh my god, great, I want to be great, and it's like the Democrats did not offer a version of that. You know what I mean?
Well, it's almost
Instead,
like
they
it's got to
said,
the point where you need to almost pose as like every other celebrity, right, these days.
Well, I mean, look,
And
that's what Obama did. That's how he got elected.
mm,
That's exactly what he did. So we can't be naive or not understand that
mm,
this is the direction that things went into, and then kind of just say no, let's just go back to the way things were before. You can't do that. So now, you know this gives the political system in a way an opportunity to react and to say, okay, this isn't working. So all these tactics that we believed in, that we told people, no, just vote blue, just it'll be okay because we believe in the American people. It's like, well, now you don't. You can't believe in the American people because they've let you down. So now you need to go out and you need to have an agenda, and that agenda has to be explicit and it has to be sweeping. So the reaction, and if you understand what I'm saying, the reaction grows along with the effect. So
mm,
it's not that 20 years from now we're just going to be 20 years more fascist. It's that 20 years from now we're going to have a 20-year, you know, a 20 years more mature resistance to fascism,
mm.
which we didn't have before.
That's an
So
interesting take, yeah.
well, it's that's what George Friedman always talks about. He says, when if you ask people, just look at inflection points in history, and if you asked people at the time what the world was going to look like in 20 years, they would usually tell you the exact opposite of the way it was. I'll give you an example. 1960. If you asked Americans, what's China going to be like in 1960, they'd say, where's China? You know what I mean? They're starving. Literally, I mean, it was like the Mao, the Great Leap Forward. They were literally starving, and they thought, okay, well, it's going to cease to exist. By 1980, hadn't ceased to exist. If you'd asked them about Russia, they'd have said, oh, the Soviet Union is going to fall. They're starving. They can't manage anything. Then by 1980, Russia had this huge space program. They had a huge military. It seemed like they were going to go on forever. Then you asked people about China, and they said, China, the communism is going to fall because they're starting to reform, and then jump 20 years after that, 2000. China has not fallen. China has not actually gotten rid of communism or authoritarianism. Russia has fallen, right? Russia has,
Mm,
turned towards supposedly Western values. And then you ask people, what's it going to look like in 2020? And they would say, Russia is going to be part of NATO. China is going to be the most powerful country in the world.
mm,
You know what I mean? And jump to 2020, and no, we're back in a Cold War with Russia, and China is uh, facing extreme difficulties, right? So what does that say in 2040?
mm,
You cannot take the conditions of 2020 and just say it's going to be like this times 10, because
mm,
that's not what happens. It's not what happens. It there's a trend, and then there's a reaction to the trend.
mm,
So the reaction is important, right? The European Union, right now it's bogged down in regulations, and so in 2040 we're not even going to be able to do anything because our regulations are going to be so oppressive. And it's like, well, no, right? Because if we're recognizing that we have a problem right now, then we're going to be solving it, and then in 2040 it's going to be, not solved, but not as big of a problem, right?
mhm,
Or it's this, like the ozone layer, right? People said in 1980, oh my god, the ozone layer is going to disappear because of CFCs, so we ban CFCs, then the ozone layer comes back. So it's
mm,
I'm not being a positivist. I'm not being like an eternal optimist. I'm not bright siding. It's
mhm,
a lot of hard work, but we don't just let problems fester without any reaction, right?
mm,
And the
mm.
reaction can be scary too. Like, it's not, if you ask people right now in 2024, what's Russia going to look like in, 2044? What are they going to tell you? I mean,
Yeah,
They're gonna say Russia's dangerous. It's going to be authoritarian. Well, we're going to invest then, aren't we, in defending ourselves? Europeans are going to invest in their military, and then that threat is not going to be as big. You know, so
mm,
I don't know. I think Zeihan doesn't give people a lot of autonomy or a lot of credit for for being self-interested, which
mm.
is a strange thing. Sorry, I've been
Why do you think
nattering.
that is actually out of interest?
Well, I think because he makes money telling people that America is special. I do.
Mm.
Um, and I'm not, I would be the first to acknowledge that that America has a lot of advantages. I mean, the ones in the book are very convincing in terms of resources, in terms of
They
food,
are,
and
yeah. Mm.
in terms of technology, many things. They have huge advantages, but the rest of the world has never, just fallen apart without them. And I don't think it's going to. I think if America pulls away from NATO and pulls away from trade in Asia, then I think that the rest of the world falls into
So
that
there's certain
space.
things that I agree, by the way, and I think there are certain things we can be reactive or proactive, even, um, and we can mitigate a lot of these kind of doom and gloom scenarios portrayed by Zihan. But there are some things that are a little more challenging. For example, depopulation.
Yeah,
Now, not so bad in the US, it seems. I did check the stats.
yeah,
But he's absolutely right. In China, it's a massive issue. Everyone knows about the single child policy, which actually made everything 10 times worse because everyone wanted males. And so they'd
yeah,
actually even disregard the females, which means that not only is there depopulation issue, there's a ratio issue as well, which
yeah.
doesn't bode well for a nation that needs to do something about it, clearly.
Right, right.
Um, Other country, the whole of Europe, in a similar trend, Japan, notoriously, etc. What can we do about that? I mean, you
Well, I
see
mean,
some countries like Italy, for example. I recently moved to Italy, not because they have a depopulation issue, because it's beautiful, but they're going to great lengths at the moment to incentivize people to migrate there, to live there as foreign people.
yeah,
Um, and
and
this
I
is
think
because a
those
lot of the young people are leaving.
measures work, right? I think they wouldn't do them if they
Same.
weren't working. I think that the fact is Italy is a beautiful place to live, and I think that if it becomes attractive enough, then people want to move there. I mean, the problem that people like Zehan have is that there just aren't enough people left to immigrate, which is true. Actually, it is a problem.
Mm,
But then there are other solutions for that as well. Japan somehow is soldiering on with a diminishing population, an aging population, by and you can see by adapting and adopting technologies that people from other countries would never accept, for now. You know what I mean?
mm.
But they have to, so they do. And I think that we're going to see similar things. I think there's going to be a, you have to, so you do sort of mentality, which
But
is,
that's not solving the depopulation issue. That's well, I suppose it depends how
it's
you
adapting to it.
perceive solving it is. Exactly, it's adapting to it. Can you really solve depopulation? I mean,
But
obviously, you
we,
could argue, which a bit of a stretch with kind of the rise of the longevity industry, perhaps. Goodness knows how far they can push that. But
well, there's longevity,
looking
and
looking at it,
there's
mm,
also
go on.
religious reformation. People may adopt, more population centric religion or religious movements. There's already some signs of that happening.
What do you mean?
Countries like, look, people who are into like quiverful movement, people who want to have 20 kids, you know those are like the bleeding edge of it. But people arguing that you have to replace your own family because nobody's going to take care of you when you're older, that
Mm.
impacts people's behaviors. And then you have countries like France where their population is not stagnating because they've created such
Yeah.
positive benefits to having kids. And I think that's the reality. If we have a system where we're severely lacking in children, then we're going to create benefits for having
Well,
kids.
but the thing is, though, is at trade policy is something that can change quickly and have a very quick chain reaction, positive chain reaction, if done
Right.
correctly. Now, changing policy to incentivize having more kids has a much bigger delayed benefit, much
It
bigger.
does.
And
But that's
Zeihan describes or portrays that we've actually got to the point where there's kind of no going back. And I didn't really understand fully as to why he laid that claim, but that's kind of the sentiment that I was reading into it.
yeah, his view is kind of that these trends have already gone too far. But in my opinion,
Yeah.
I find that to be practically like a Malthusian conclusion. You know, I think the
Mm.
reality, he talks about, oh, China needs to thread the needle, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
what do we see historically that people thread the needle all the time?
Mm.
He has this conclusion that demographics is destiny, right? That no matter what, the demographics are going to impact. The demographics are going to tell the story. If your population is growing and your ability to feed that population is growing, you're going to be fine. And if they're not, and it isn't, then you're not. But you know, all those adaptions that we implement, those also, some of them are already underway and some of them won't be felt for years. So
Mm.
and those things will be felt. It's like China. The idea in 2000 was their economy was going to fall apart because they were running out of cheap workers, so they moved 300 million people into their cities, and they
Sure.
kept
Yeah.
going. And of course, that delayed a bigger problem, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a next solution to that and a next one after that.
Mm.
Until demographics is no longer the biggest issue, which it won't be forever, right? And yeah,
Mm.
maybe longevity, artificial intelligence, or just you know a combination. What's the reality? It's going to be a combination, right? It's going to be
Mm.
many things happening. Um,
Yeah, because I feel like generally he predicts catastrophe very, very quickly. I think he said that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he said China has 10 years left or something due
Essentially,
to
the
depopulation.
the way he put it was like the question of whether China will continue to exist as a state, which who knows? Maybe that's
As a
true, but
single state, he means? Like, or divided?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
he's implying,
Which
okay, yeah.
which I mean, okay, if you go back into Chinese history, that makes sense. China
It does,
has
actually.
has split apart and fractured into a million pieces over and over and over again throughout history.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
actually, it would be surprising if it didn't at some point. But the point is that in none of those cycles did the people did life in China cease. You know what I mean? It just keeps going. Whether it's going to be something different, well,
Well, and it also, maybe de-globalization bodes well for an insular, a culturally insular country like China, because they are quite um, maybe de-industrialization isn't a bad thing for that culture.
yeah. I mean, who knows? China has obviously in the past shown a tolerance for extreme suffering of its people,
Mm,
and I think Zehan is right that the suffering that we contemplate today is quite minor compared to some of the things that we've experienced in the past.
of course, yeah.
And he points out that the reality is that those conditions can return, which I think is true, and I think certainly they will in certain places. Look at the situation. He gave the example of Afghanistan, where
Mm,
American involvement has largely ceased, where the rest of the world finds no market for its goods, and where the population has very few skills, and very little ability to feed itself. that is a recipe for a disaster.
Mm.
And it will probably be a disaster. But the idea that that presages the end of the world, the way his central conceit is, I don't know. I don't know.
Well, yeah. I mean, he kind of makes it sound like as soon as the US withdraws from the seas, that there's going to be, piracy like it's prime 1600s, and I just
And
don't, I don't really buy it.
I don't buy that the U.S. is going to withdraw from the rest of the world, if only because it has so much profit to be made from it. The American military, is such a an economic, dynamo for the U.S. I don't see why that would stop.
Well,
Um,
it's a burden they bear for the benefit of everyone, but primarily themselves. Like,
right,
there's no
right,
point
yeah.
having a bigger slice of a smaller macro
Well,
economy. You'd prefer to have.
there's this very, I think, very solipsistic view of like, oh, America is just doing this thing for the benefit of the world. And it's like, yeah, it's for the benefit of the world so that the world will use dollars. Because if the
Exactly,
world,
yeah,
he talks about
and
the
capitalism.
Bretton, right, he talks about the Bretton Woods system, which is the system whereby the United States essentially guarantees both global trade, global free trade, and global financial security in exchange for control, essentially, of global trade.
Mm,
But the reason the U.S. does that is because that's the money that all the different countries use is going to be in dollars, and it's going to go through the American financial system. And by some estimates, the U.S. benefits to the tune of about 20% of the entire global economy just for that.
mm,
So we may pay $1 trillion a year to our military, but we make 20 trillion a year off of
mm,
the Bretton Woods system. So,
right.
it's not a charity case.
Mm,
We do it for a
interesting.
reason, and we want other countries to be prosperous so that they can trade with us, right? That hasn't changed. You
Yeah.
know, it's like a lot of people think that American involvement in the Middle East is about getting oil from America, which it isn't. Right? It's not about getting oil for America. It's about getting oil for Europe, because
Mm,
because Americans want Europe to be economically vital so that they can do trade with it.
yeah.
So on the order of things to worry about, the US is worried about stabilizing whole other regions of the world so that they can
But
make more
this
money.
this is this is kind of why I was a little concerned with the outcome of the election on Tuesday, because Trump has mentioned overspending on global affairs
Mm-hmm.
that America has been propping up,
Mm-hmm.
as he put it, for many years. And I whilst I don't think it would be quite what Zion describes, if they were to somewhat um, you know
Pull
um,
back.
pull back. It would certainly have some impact for
Well,
sure.
suppose so just play it through. Suppose that they do. Suppose
Mm,
that the U.S. Moves troops out of Europe. Suppose that the U.S. stops guaranteeing trade from the South China Sea, from Southeast Asia to Japan.
mm,
A year from now, U.S. consumers are not going to be able to buy products from Korea, right? And when they can't buy their Samsung TVs from Korea, they're gonna they're gonna wonder why, right? And then the
mm,
Koreans are gonna say, because we can't get this from the Philippines, and then the Filipinos are gonna say we can't get our oil you know from Saudi, and the Saudis are gonna say we're sending the oil, but it's getting taken by people in off the coast of Africa, and then what are the Americans actually going to do? They're going to do the same thing that they always do, in my opinion, which is they're going to send a ship to the coast of Somalia, and they're going to make sure the oil gets through, right? Because it's money, right? It's
I agree
businesses.
with you. I agree with you, but I guess it just seems like there's a few signals that may suggest otherwise. Trump
Yeah.
basically saying the investment in military is too high, also doubling down on investment for manufacturing within the US, especially semiconductors, which of course is something that we rely from Taiwan, etc. So there are some signals there. I do tend to agree with you. I think
Well,
it seems highly unlikely, but
I mean, it's what gosh, what's his name? The author who wrote uh, *Sapiens*.
oh, uh,
Yuval Noah Harari.
Yuval, yeah,
Yeah,
Harari, yeah.
he talked about this. He said, right now, the European Union is in a situation where we are getting the benefits of high military expenditure without spending the money, right? So typically 30%, 20 to 30% of public funds would go to the military, and right now it's like two. So he argues, at if the Americans pull back, America, then Europe will have to remilitarize, and it will have to take over that same role. Someone will have to do it, and the Europeans also will extract a toll for doing that, right? So it will become a more imperial power because it has to be one. So I don't see any reason that people in Europe don't want to maintain their standard of living, and in order to do that, they need all those other things to happen. So I tend to think not that like um, not that like things will always remain the same, but that like someone George Friedman also makes this point in his books. He just says someone will lead because someone always does. Someone will be put in that position, and there's a position where there's profit to be made by leading. So that's what someone will do. If it's not America, then yeah, it is someone else. It's Mexico. Who knows?
But yeah, which seems unlikely.
Not as unlikely as one might think. I mean, a country with a growing industrial base, a growing population that has interests in, global supply chains, just as America does. And if the Americans aren't willing to, take care of the supply chains, then Mexico will, or the Europeans will do it themselves. Someone will, and someone will extract a toll for that. When the British, decolonialized and got rid of their empire, that empire didn't disappear, did it? It got taken over. So I don't see any reason why someone else wouldn't want to. You seem to be much more. It's funny. I'm usually much more pessimistic than you. So what sits uneasily?
No,
with you?
I don't. I'm not. I'm not pessimistic. I think Zeihan's pessimistic. I think I think the signals are, for the most part, undeniable. Whilst I did scrutinize a couple, especially on China, and actually, I'd like to speak about Russia in a minute.
Sure.
But generally, I am actually more optimistic than Zeihan, and mine's very much from a technological perspective. In terms of energy, we have nuclear and many other forms, wind,
Yeah, he
solar,
completely
depending on where you are.
he completely like just hand waves nuclear aside, which to me is crazy.
Yeah,
Because
I didn't get it.
yeah, it was like that's not a factor. Are you kidding? Like that's what the Soviet
But he
Union
did
was
that with
based on.
many things. He did it with many things. He
Yeah.
disregarded nuclear, disregarded genomics for food. Longevity industry, the
Yeah.
AI, for example, pretty big one.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it was published in 2022, so perhaps that's a bit harsh. But
Well, I mean,
yeah, I
maybe
see. I'm
he's
positive because of technology, I would say.
maybe he there are some right things in that. Like there was something I shared with you today on our company channel, which was talking about the doorman fallacy. for
What's that?
automation. So the doorman fallacy is the idea of some business consultants, management consultants come into a 5-star hotel, and they look around and they see that the hotel employs 5 doormen, right? And those doormen, all they seem to be doing is opening doors, right? So the company says, so the management consultants say, okay, we can fire those people. We'll save you $500,000 a year, and or whatever, it's less than that, but we'll save you this amount of money, and you'll be much more profitable. The hotel fires the 5 doormen and installs automatic doors, and then a year later, residency in the hotel is down by 50%, and there's homeless people in the lobby. The reason, because the doormen don't just open the doors, right? They also
Sure.
keep the community safe. They also clean up. They also do many things. So it's like, I think one of the arguments about AI is that you can replace individual actions, and we talk about this a lot in what we do together. You can you can automate a lot of routines, but you can't replace people, because people don't just do routines. People also do thinking. People also do unofficial things that aren't in their job descriptions. But and yet,
Especially in
automation.
Japan, by the way.
Yeah, especially in Japan. But also automation went from the agriculture industry 100 years ago employed 30% of people. Today it employs less than 1%. So obviously, automation allowed one person to produce many, many, many times more calories. So why there's no, in my opinion, no clear reason why automation couldn't allow one person to do much, much more productivity.
Yeah, I agree.
Just because it's hard to imagine, but it was hard to imagine 100 years ago that only 1% of a population could grow food for the other 99.
Yeah.
You know.
So we've focused a lot
You wanted to
on
talk about
China,
Russia,
haven't we?
so yeah.
Yeah,
So
just a little, just a little. So Zeihan was kind of similarly treating Russia. He kind of made out that it's inevitable that Russia will kind of reach its demise, essentially. It's just a matter of when and how. What's your take on
it's interesting.
his comments around Russia?
So again, his
And by the
argument.
way, Zeihan did um, probably not very hard to predict, but he did predict correctly that Russia would invade Ukraine.
I'll give him even less credit than you, because actually, that was predicted in a book about 10 years earlier by George Friedman.
Okay.
And it was given almost down to I think the year. I think he was a year late. But
wow.
yeah,
That's
and
impressive.
Russia actually did plan to invade in 2021, not in 2022. So, COVID was the
Okay.
only thing that, well, yeah, it's surprising in a way, and another way it's not, because every year the argument goes, every year Russia's population gets older, its demographics get worse, and its ability to have a large and powerful military declines. So the same reason that the invasion of Ukraine was poorly executed and failed to reach Kiev is the same reason that they had to launch the war when they did, because every year it was only going to get worse. Right? There isn't enough money. There's enough money from tax revenues to pay for the military. Then the military becomes more corrupt. They start stealing and selling equipment, and the economy is becoming more and more concentrated in state firms that are selling energy. And as you do that, you become more and more reliant on external trade to keep your economy going. So the only chance that Russia had to keep itself relevant was to expand its territory. That's the theory. And that's the main basis behind invading Ukraine is we need to expand our territory so that we can stay relevant. Ukraine grows a lot of food. Ukraine has access to deep water ports in Crimea, and it has
When you
oil and
say
gas.
relevant, do you mean from a trade perspective,
Literally relevant,
or
like literally a power. Russia. That's the thing. That's a cultural value. Russia needs to be powerful. That's the thing that it's always wanted, right? The thing that it's always been willing to sacrifice to get is to be powerful, and it doesn't matter, why. Uh,
so Zeihan focuses considerably on China, quite a bit on Russia comparatively to anywhere else. What do you think the common denominator is? Is it the dictatorship or
no, I think the dictatorships are.
geopolitics?
Yeah, I think the dictatorships both are a symptom of that effect. They become authoritarian because that is the only way to manage a
Right.
state in decline. It's the only way. The China could not be a democratic pluralist society with 40% of their population in wage slavery, right? Just like
Right.
Russia cannot be a pluralist society where the only thing that they really do is sell gas, right? And have huge projects. It's not, it's not a diverse enough country. It's not a diverse enough economy for people to be satisfied with their leadership, unless their leadership is oppressing them, which is what Russia does, right, and has done for generations. I mean, this is not new, right? It's hundreds of years. So his prediction of the invasion was based on this need for relevance, and a cultural value that they've always had, just as China has always had a cultural value of one China, the one China policy. It comes from an ancient belief, all under heaven. You know this phrase?
I don't think so.
All under heaven is the idea that China is one land, the center of the world, and the destiny of humanity. So that is the mandate of God, all under heaven, that China must exist, right? That China must be one country. And it goes back to like the Qin dynasty, thousands of years. And Russia's the same. Russia has to be a power. It has to be a great land, and it goes back to the Kievan Rus, right? Also, almost 1,000 years. So, and they would claim that it goes back to the Byzantine Empire. It goes all the way back to Rome, right? For them, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But that is, that's why when the invasion happened, Putin was on about things like Peter the Great, things that people in the West don't even think about anymore. Right?
Sure, yeah, that was strange.
But that is for them, like they see themselves as the inheritor of the Eastern Roman Empire, the continuation of Rome. Rome is the center of all civilization. Therefore, they are the descendant of all of the great world civilization, and they must rule all of Eurasia, right? That is their destiny, and no other arrangement is possible, right? So it's hard for us to understand because you're from a relatively small island, even though it was an imperialist nation, and I'm from America, which was a settler nation. But that is their mandate. It's the thing that they have to believe, and anything less is a humiliation. That's why in the 90s, the famines and the political corruption was just so devastating to Russia. Why they couldn't accept the diminution of their status.
Sure.
So I don't know. Does that answer your question? I don't know if I really know. It's something that maybe we can't understand.
a lot of Russia baffles me, honestly.
Me too. Me too.
Is there anything else you wanted to deep dive into, Lloyd, or do you want to provide some feedback, recommendations, and
Yeah, let's talk about
generally
the
how you
book.
found it?
You mentioned the accent, and he's from Iowa, and I was I was enjoying this book for like the first hour or two, and listening to it. I mean, and then it really started to grate on me his sense
Oh,
of.
so I was the other way round.
Oh, really?
Oh
his
well, actually, sorry. Finish what you're saying. Sorry,
his
go on.
sense of humor, his little asides
Mm,
and things, which are
mm.
only funny to a midwestern white middle aged male. Um, ugh, I was so
That's so true, dude.
I was so done with it. Like these little sides, like rock and roll. It's like just shut up. You know,
Well, I found it super jarring at the beginning. Then I found it more tolerable as I went on, and actually found it a bit cute. But then, yes, I would have to agree with you
but
there.
it's like
Towards the end,
he
it
has
was.
this bit where he's talking about molybdenum, and he's like mulla 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 mulla
Yeah, I
mulla,
remember.
and then he's like Molly, we'll just call it Molly, and it's like, dude, just say molybdenum. Like what the like
Yeah.
you wrote this to be like this? Like it's cute, I guess. It's cute if
Mm,
you're writing like a blog post for, you know what I mean? But it's and
sure.
I'm sure that's how it was originally conceived, but like
It was quite hard to take him seriously at
yeah,
times.
yeah,
Yeah.
and that was really like it was weird. I understand that it's like trying to be accessible, but it ends up being quite annoying and quite kind of condescending in a way.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, I found it condescending, but I do think you're right. Though I think it was a technique to try to be more accessible, which is, fine. That's
It's fine, but
that intent is
to me, you know, I'm a writer somewhat. I'm a copywriter. You know how I think about these things. I think if someone is talking down to you, that means that
mm,
they think that you're not smart enough to feel condescended to. So,
mm,
and you know, that's a technique. I can use that to condescend to someone and make them feel inferior to me, but I
mm,
don't do it without that in mind, because talking down to someone does put you on a different plane. And I think that he relies on that instead of making a persuasive case. In a lot
I
of
agree.
cases, like just saying, "Oh, European regulations are crazy," and it's like that's not an argument, dude.
Oh, Peter,
That's just like, by the
Peter,
way,
Peter, Peter.
yeah, that's just like, by the way, I know things you don't know. Like, you know, believe me, trust me,
Yeah.
bro. And there was a lot of this kind of trust me, bro kind of mentality to a
Mm.
lot of it, which I thought was
I wonder if it's written like that, or if he kind of changed it up when he was narrating it for Audible. I'm not sure
I think
actually.
he's like that. I think he's just a bit of
I
a
think he is like that. I just wonder whether it's written like that, as in text in a book.
oh,
Um,
well, that's why I like audiobooks, because it does bring the voice of the author much more, you know, into focus. Um,
yeah, and it makes it more genuine, and they're passionate about what they're reading, which is great until that happens.
yeah, until you find out that they're just kind of a dick a little bit, you know.
Yeah.
Like I think he's just a bit of a
Yeah, I especially found the way that he spoke about China to be quite repugnantly arrogant, actually,
mm.
honestly, at times. Um,
Like it is
yeah,
arrogant. It is arrogant, and it ignores a lot of a lot of depth and a lot of nuance to everything. Um, and there's a lot of ways to do that, but I think the main thing for him was it is supposed to be reassuring to Americans. I think that's the reality. It's supposed to
and
be,
he probably did a good job at that, I would
yeah.
imagine. I mean, I don't know if this is how well this book has done, actually. I don't know if you know, Lloyd, but
I think it did.
he's probably done a pretty good job at that.
I think it did reasonably well, and I think this maybe is one of the reasons. So if you're reading it, you know, and you're
Mm,
feeling like, "Hey, this guy gets me," it's like, yeah, it's written for you. It's written for Americans
yeah.
to feel good about themselves a little bit.
And content wise, did you enjoy it?
Uh, I enjoyed the beginning when it became clear that he was going to rely on this assault of, you know, one note that I wrote for myself was appeal to. Damn it! I'm gonna butcher my own note. Appeal to absurdity and appeal and to incredulity and complexity. He's incredulous at the idea that we have a complicated global supply system and therefore it can't last. That's essentially the logic. And that's, in my opinion, a very poor basis for an argument. I don't get it, therefore it's it's fundamentally broken.
I think you're right, actually, and I think that's why I felt like he kind of started with the fantastical claim and then had to back it up with whatever he could scramble.
Well, and I think he seems to be fairly anti-academic, anti-intellectual in some ways. He because he's a demographics, our destiny bro, so it can never be political philosophy. It can never be economic theory. It always has to be his thing. It always has to be, everything has to be demographics. Everything has to be country wants this, does this, and it can never be more complicated than that. And that's, or any complication is just a distraction, right? So it's very selective.
And I think that kind of bodes well again with his readers, maybe with Americans.
Well, that's what I was saying. Like you were saying, but he gets paid by the State Department to give talks. I'm like, I'm not surprised. I'm not in the least surprised that they would pay him to give talks because he tells them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly what they want to hear. And also we didn't even get into his politics that much, but he is known for let's say flirting with Trumpists and IDW, intellectual dark web.
Is he now?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because he's an Americanist, and that's that's where the business is.
I can't say I'm surprised. I mean, definitely reading the book that's definitely the impression I got.
He gave me the impression of the kid in your class who was always smarter than everyone and didn't need to show his work because it was obvious. It's obvious. It's so obvious, and a lot of the times, this from your personal experiences, and I was that kid at some times. That kid is wrong because he's ignoring things that he doesn't understand, and that's what I've found in my life. Every time that I think something is so obvious as he seems to think this is, I've been wrong because,
Well, it's funny because the more I learn, the more I experience, the more I read, the more I realize I don't know. And when you're young, you're all kind of susceptible to the Cunning-Kruger effect, aren't you? Where you kind of, especially if you're a high achiever,
Cunning-Kruger is
reinforced.
Cunning-Kruger is a nice Dunning-Kruger. You meant.
Cunning-Kruger. That means something very different, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's something to that. Like there's this false sense of confidence, and maybe it's necessary to have a book like The End of the World is Just the Beginning is like a very provocative, very it's a very provocative title that demands a lot of evidence. And
look, I'm pleased I read it.
Yeah.
I like you, I don't agree with it. I found it insightful. There was a lot of stuff in there I didn't know that I think is factually true in terms of the trends and signals. I think his conclusions were fantastical and I don't agree with them.
Yeah, I think
some things. Go on.
It's absolutely right. I think there's one good thing you can say for any book is that you will not be dumber for having read it. I think you will not
Right.
be dumber for having read this book. You will learn things that you did probably not know, because nobody knows all those things.
Mm.
Like, they're so distantly related to each other. But yeah. Do you want to know why potassium is a big problem for geopolitics? You can find out, and that can give you something to look at and something to think about. Should you believe all those interconnected conclusions, based on what one small piece of information you know about potassium? No. You should think,
Mm.
and you should consider all the things that he maybe doesn't know. Um,
And you should have more faith in people and technology.
I don't. Yeah, I disagree with you on that, and I don't have any faith in technology. Technology, as far as I know, has never solved any problems, but people solve problems all the time. I use the example of, like, what I'm talking about when I say that is like, when people look at like the pyramids and they go, "How did they build it?" And it's like, well, people were smart, right? And they didn't have
Mm.
all the technologies you would use today to make that, but they figured it out. So people are
Mm.
smart. I think like technologies are just right. It's just
Well, technology is the product of people being motivated to solve
exactly
something, really. But yeah, it's people.
motivated people, and I think like there's always some push to be reductive, to say, yeah, economics is everything, because that economics is motivation. But it's like, no, motivation is even bigger than that.
Yeah,
Technology is
absolutely.
bigger than I mean, technology is a part of motivation. Economics is a part of motivation. Culture is a part of motivation. People,
Mm.
people have complex, motivations, uh, and I think that's the main thing I would say to step away from it is, when people are motivated to do something, they're going to figure out a way to do it. And I don't see
Yeah,
any reason that would stop being true.
I agree with that.
Surprisingly, because when you think, I don't know if you ever do this, but I sit thinking, God, can you imagine living in the year 1800, and in order to get like a pound of sugar, this is what you'd have to do, and it's like, oh, just kill me now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
but but they did it, right? Because that's what they had to do. So people.
Mm.
I think it is a bit of that American sort of thing of like, oh, if I couldn't get my Costco muffins for 5 cents, delivered, at 6 a.m. every day, by drone, then I couldn't live. And
Mm.
it's like, no, if you could no longer buy strawberries at Christmas in California, I think people would survive.
Well, I think there's a sweet spot. Like, we are over consuming now.
Exactly.
And I think depopulation is bad. And obviously, deindustrialization to a point is bad. But maybe it's not so bad to a degree because it's not all good.
It's not all good. Exactly. It's not all good. It's the modern world, the modern global system is not all good.
And look, sometimes catastrophes even happen for a reason. Like, sometimes we do need a bit of a change.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And people, I'm
you
sure
know,
that there are people
none of us
I'm sure
do.
there are people who listen to this and hear, I'm always shit talking capitalism, and they're probably like, "Oh, what do you want to live in Soviet Russia?" And it's like, no, absolutely not. I want to have my Costco muffins. God damn it! But I
Yeah.
just want, I just want to have, a little bit more fairness, maybe a little bit less consumption. I want to find a comfortable life, a medium. And I don't believe in
And look, it's never that black and
no.
white anyway, and I don't think either of us ever pretend to think that,
Neither of
right?
us are experts in any of this. So,
Exactly.
except in what we feel and what we enjoy. So I would say, the whole point of these conversations is just to talk about our experience of knowledge and books, and that's what I like doing.
And we're average bros, right? I mean, look, we might be talking complete nonsense, but it's just our perspective.
Yeah. So So, read this book, enjoy this book. Don't take this book as the answer to, every question. Understand that it's
Draw your own conclusions.
Understand where it's coming from economically and culturally, and go out and read other things, and and have a creative thought, and make something, invent something, and do your part. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to say?
Lloyd. And that's a nice note to end it on. I agree with a lot of your assessment there. No recommendations per se on this topic of geopolitics, I guess.
Yeah, I think it wasn't for the most part, it wasn't boring, and that's a good thing.
I agree. I enjoyed it. I don't regret reading it. I learned things. I disagreed with a lot, but it certainly provoked thought, and that's what it's about.
Yeah, exactly. So let's finish there. This has been Two Bros, One Book. The book, once again, is Peter Zeihan. Damn it, I don't have it in front of me again.
The end of the world is just the beginning. Mapping the collapse of globalization.
The end of the world is just the beginning. So we listened to it on Audible. I think you can get it in hardcover and paperback on Amazon. I'll put a link, and we'll see you next time. I've been Lloyd.
I've been Will.
And next time.
Cheers, guys.
Shoot at you actors like movie directors. Say the movie, dogs.
Now, before I finish, let me just say, I did not come here to show out. Did not come here to impress you. Because to tell you the truth, when I leave here, I'm gone. And I don't care what you think about me. But just remember, when it hits the fan, brother, whether it's next year, 10 years, 20 years from now, you'll never be able to say that these brothers lied to you, Jack.
Thing ain't lie. I done came through the block and everything that's